Thank you. I'm particularly concerned. Age Scotland has produced figures saying that there are 500,000 people over the age of 60 in Scotland who don't use the internet, etc. And with the loss of banking facilities and ATMs, oops,
London College.
that's okay. And the fact that cash is still a vital means of budgeting, as Mr. Young has said, for almost 20% of the population. Are you seeing a growth in concern, people coming, particularly to Mr. Young, to your organisation, from that sector? Older people who don't use the internet and who have lived their entire lives using cash or cheques?
Yes, well, Citizens Advice Scotland produced a couple of reports on this within the last period. That many people do remain digitally excluded. You've mentioned Age Scotland. Actually, I spent some time working for them, so that's issues with which I'm familiar. But Citizens Advice reports suggested that a third of people who come to bureaus, according to a survey we did of 1,100 clients, found difficulty in using the internet. So that was 18% said they found using a computer difficult, 16% did not use one at all. A fifth of respondents to the survey said they never used the internet, and a further fifth only did so via a smartphone. Now, of those, ownership of a smartphone is not necessarily a reliable indicator about how you access information and how you access services. 4 in 10 of those who only accessed the internet via smartphone reported that data costs, for example, were an issue for them in doing so. There's an extra factor which I think is particularly relevant for older people who might be bureau clients, which is that even if they own a smartphone, they may use it for a very limited number of functions. People tend to be more reluctant in using phones and digital devices for issues involving money as opposed to accessing information or participating in social media. This comes back to the point I made before, is that there's a higher degree of trust in face-to-face interactions where people feel more sensitive about the issue being discussed, are also where they feel less confident about using technology to access what they want to.
See that comment by Ms Norman brings me back to what I was saying earlier about the 500,000 people over the age of 60 who don't like using cash. That's the equivalent of the population of Edinburgh. So you're taking, if you stop using cash or you make it difficult to have cash, you're taking the equivalent of an entire city out of the... You're taking away from them the opportunity to use the system that they know. And are there not inherent dangers in doing that? And, you know, just taking people out of the system and ignoring them completely and not providing them with the facilities that they need.
Yes, and I think that backs up the point I made before. I mean, we haven't conducted any analysis of whether people would be willing to have, you know, digital chips inserted. But you can, no, we haven't got a Black Mirror aspect to this. But yeah. But I can imagine, without wishing to speculate too much, the types of people who already struggle with technology by accessing smartphones might be among those which are most reluctant to have any kind of digital imprint, which would allow them to securely access cash. I actually just wanted to come in on a related point, which is we mentioned a few other countries. There is an access to cash point about this as well, related to tourism. So if people are visiting Scotland and they do not have funds in sterling, the single euro payments area regulatory model means that people who hold funds denominated elsewhere in other currencies can use an ATM and access them at the mid-market exchange rate. So that's a consumer protection that's available. There is a Brexit wrinkle to this, as there is on many different issues, because the members of the payments area are members of the EU 28 at the moment and the European Economic Area. So there's a protection for consumers who come here and were able to access sterling via ATMs. So it would depend upon whatever transitional arrangements or further relationships are agreed. And I know that's a contentious issue today. If as a result of Brexit, then that would no longer apply. Now, cash might be quite important for some consumers, particularly if they're older. So it might well be that some tourists who are older prefer to use cash. And in rural areas, obviously, tourism is a very significant industry. So we don't have analysis of what the impact on tourism might be of diminishing access to cash for tourists. but there are good reasons to think it's something that would need to be borne in mind.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. We've heard regularly at this committee and elsewhere, the bank set out the increased use of online and mobile app banking and reduced footfall to branches as reasons for local closures. We've talked about this already today. But in essence, how viable is online banking as an alternative to in-branch banking?
That's a big issue in certain parts of Scotland. But even where you do have access to broadband, you need the equipment to use it as well. You need to make sure that it's up to date and is secure, and that's not necessarily what everybody can manage to do. As I've referred to previously, there are people who do find ways around it. They use family to help them. Certainly older people, I know some are very willing to try, but if something unexpected happens, it's very difficult for them to work around it. So in practice, it's not as usable as it might be, although it certainly is a good solution for run-of-the-mill transactions for some people in some areas, but it's not a universal solution.
I have to declare an interest here. Living in Edinburgh, where we have lost so many branches, that one bank I know of that you have to come out, you have to come in from the very furthest community, right into the centre of Edinburgh before you will get a branch or an ATM for that particular bank. Although that didn't affect me, I had an issue recently where I needed to go into a branch. It wasn't something that could be done online. Now, if you live in an area where there are no longer any branches, even the post office can't help you, because what you need to do is talk to somebody at that bank. And, you know, as to hark back to H Scotland, there is a large population, a large number of people in the country who don't actually use, as you said yourselves, online banking facilities. They don't have access to computers or use computers or whatever. So are we beginning to get into a kind of two-tier system?
Potentially so. I think my generation is carrying a lot in terms of their children and their parents at the moment. But yes, I think it's possible, because in terms of rural communities, it's again that accessibility, the transport to the branch, because there are things, as you say, that you do have to go speak to somebody in a branch. You can try phoning them up, but it still isn't quite the same. So yeah, I do think that urban communities possibly, although you maybe have to travel some distance also to get there, perhaps transport issues, you may be more likely to have public transport than in rural areas where there may be none at all. So for some people who don't have access to cars, it is a much bigger issue, so wherever you live.
Just the reason I ask is, in London, I use my phone or my contactless card all the time. I very rarely have cash for anything. When I go to Edinburgh, it's much the same. However, my family home in the Highlands, when I go there, I need cash and there's no ATM. So we are beginning to find that one section of the community is living quite easily with online banking and digital banking, but there's an entire section of the community which is just being completely shut out.
I think there is an issue there, and possibly rural communities don't always appreciate that, because we don't tend to go to urban areas so much, so we only know what we know, what we are used to, and what we work around on a daily basis. So it sometimes takes rural communities seeing what urban communities actually have for them to realise that they're being left behind or shut out.
Can I make a couple of points on this? Firstly, the digital exclusion point. I can commend to you, and I'm very happy to share with the committee details of this. The Royal Society of Edinburgh have done, I think, the most comprehensive study of the impact of digital exclusion. They looked at all the various reasons why people might be excluded and the different groups which are disproportionately affected. They looked at things like skills, confidence, motivation, and also access, and access for different reasons, either because people lack broadband service in their own home or because they just cannot afford to maintain that. The Carnegie UK Trust have also looked at low income and poverty as being a lack of access driver. They produced a study on Glasgow calling it a digital desert for many communities. So there's a lot of material that's available, and I think that would help assist the committee with the rest of the inquiry. On the point about branches being important in order to be able to access banking services. There's an element which we've seen across the Citizens Advice Bureau, which is that more people have been driven to open bank accounts where they haven't done so before because of the welfare reforms recently. Universal credit is paid directly into a bank account, unlike some of the legacy benefits, such as, for example, housing benefit was paid directly to landlords. Now, the Scottish Government has the ability to change regulations to revert to that, but they're not in force yet. And so at the moment, people are being required to open bank accounts where they hadn't done so before. And they have no relationship. And so for those types of customers, going and speaking to an individual where you're establishing a bank relationship for the first time is really quite important. It's important to place people at their ease and have them understand what their rights and obligations are. And it's particularly important for universal credit, I should say, because we know that there are difficulties with the implementation of universal credit. So, for example, there is a mismatch between the timing between when funds are needed to pay rent and when they're actually paid. So it's quite possible, we see this across Bureau, across Scotland, people are left in arrears. And so they may have demands for payment being made to the bank account, which then get refused. So you need to have that relationship of trust and understanding between a bank and their customer. That's much more likely to happen where you have that face-to-face interaction, and particularly for groups of people who are just starting out in a banking relationship.
There's probably a very simple answer to this question, and it's never ever struck me before because I've never had to do it. But how do you open a bank account if there isn't a branch there?
You can potentially apply for banking, opening a bank account online. You can then be sent paperwork and so on. But and a lot of credit checks, for example, that can be carried out remotely. But we need to look into this. But I suspect most people, when they open an account for the first time, do so in branch.
So if you live in a rural community where the banks have been closed and you've got bad broadband and you're on universal credit,
yes. Well,
there's a whole lot of problems there for you to overcome just to live every day.
One of those classic problems where different problems layer on top of each other.
There are some support in rural communities in like a computing hub, say in a building, whether it's a public building or another one. Local authorities do tend to put on support services to help people fill in forms online to do things like open a bank account. So there is some assistance there.
But one of the, if you like, counter proposals to the closures and losing the ATMs has been banking hubs. Would it be easier, more cost effective for the banks to provide a branch in an area rather than mobile branches? Would that get round many of these problems that you've identified about accessibility, timings, weather? You don't want to go out and stand out in the rain waiting for the bank to arrive. Also, I mean, I remember we had them in the 1970s in the Highlands, so it's a bit of a throwback. But I mean, would something like banking hubs, which I know a lot of organisations support, would that get round this?
Potentially. I mean, there's an individual called Jeff Payne, I think, who's a retired accountant, who's done a study of this. And he's obviously got some proposals. We can certainly see the advantage, and obviously if the costs were shared between different banks in the one premises, then that would obviously cut some of the financial drivers. I think from a consumer's point of view, as long as they were satisfied that they still had the same amount of privacy in their communications with an employee of a shared banking setup or a hub, then obviously they'd far prefer any solution which could mean that a physical presence in a community could be maintained.
What's